In this section, we're going to look at the influences of why people choose to do certain activities or why they might not be able to do them. So these influences range from those people around you to not being able to afford to do it, or because of where you live, that might affect what choice of activity that you choose to do. So as far as the GCSE course is concerned, there are 6 influences that you need to be aware of. And they are people, image, cultural, resources, health and well-being, and socio-economic. So the way I remember it is health crisp. So we have health, cultural, resources, image, socio-economic, and people. So we'll start with people. So people can be quite a big influence whether we take part in sport or not. So our family and our peer groups are really, really key influences whether we choose to do a certain sport. So for instance, you might choose to play football because your friends play football. You might choose to join a certain club because your friends play at that club. In the same way, if your family likes sport, there's a fair chance that you will like sport as well, or you'll be encouraged to take sport up. The second one is image. Now, image can be broken up into different categories. So we have fashion and media coverage. So with our fashion, certain sports have a particular fashion or an image about them. So they can be quite cool to do. So for instance, skateboarding has quite a fashion or a image which goes along with it. So that might be a reason of why somebody chooses to do skateboarding or snowboarding. The media coverage is a really key aspect because that can change how that image of the sport is portrayed. So for instance, for 2 weeks a year, everybody wants to play tennis because it's on TV because of Wimbledon. For a lot of the rest of the year, people aren't interested, so therefore they don't take up tennis as regularly as they do other sports. Things like women's sport can be affected by the media coverage because if it isn't on TV, people don't necessarily know about it, so therefore people might not get involved in a particular sport. So that can be a really big factor in minority sports as well. Our third one are cultural factors. Now the cultural factors can be broken up into different categories. So we have disability, age, gender, and race. Now each of these things can't be changed, and that's the way that I remember the cultural factors. So we can't change how old we are, we can't change our gender, for instance. So disability can be a factor of if we take part in a sport, or also which sport we choose to take part in. So for instance, the British Paralympic team in Beijing and in the London Olympics were very successful. So that might influence people to take part in a sport because they've seen people who have a similar disability. In the same way though, you might be influenced into not taking part in certain sports because you have a disability and might feel that you're not able to, or you might not be able to because of the facilities around you. Age is the next one. Now age is a cultural factor, and that can affect what sports you participate in because of the age restrictions that certain sports have. So for instance, you can't participate in the London Marathon until you're 18 years old. So that's an influence if you take part in a certain activity. Gender is the next one. Now gender is a really big influence to which sports people choose to play. Now at schools, traditionally, girls play hockey and netball, and more recently football's becoming more and more popular. But rugby is still seen by a lot of girls as maybe a bit of a boys' sport, and that can be an influence whether they choose to take it up or not. In the same way, some of the boys in your GCSE PE might be doing netball, but it doesn't mean you'd be able to play that at a league level because there isn't a league there. And the final one is race. Now with race being a cultural factor, here we're looking at role models as being a really key thing. So we might be influenced by people from a similar ethnic background to us. So for instance, Tiger Woods has improved or increased the amount of people taking up golf, okay, particularly from certain ethnic origins. There's a lot more black footballers than there were maybe in the 60s and 70s. So as the role models increase, people choose to play a certain sport, maybe more than they would have done previously. Our fourth influence is resources. Now resources are really, really key because we need to have the availability, the location, as well as the access and time. So there's 4 subcategories there for the resources. So availability is really key. So if we don't have the available or suitable resources or facilities, then we're not able to participate in that activity. So for instance, if you don't live close to a golf course, it's going to be very difficult for you to become a good golfer. Location is paramount as well. So location is a resources influence. So if you wanted to take up skiing and you were from Great Britain, it might be quite difficult because there's not the availability or the location where we might be able to go skiing regularly. Access is the next thing. Now you might have to travel long distances to try and get to where you play your sport. And that becomes a really, really big factor is if you can't get there. So that might influence you playing a sport because you might have facilities close to you which are of a particular type of sport, such as tennis, whereas maybe your nearest cricket ground might be several miles away and you're not able to travel that far. The final one is time. So the final time resource is really key, particularly as you get older. So as we get older, obviously work takes over, we have different stresses and strains on our life, so therefore time is a really big factor. So that might mean that older people don't play as much sport because they don't have the time to do that. The fifth one is health and well-being. Now this might dictate whether you do a particular sport because you might have a health issue or maybe your well-being is in question. So for instance, if you have asthma, you might find running quite hard because particularly in cold weather your chest can get very tight and that can make it quite difficult to be good at that activity. So people with asthma can sometimes be advised to go swimming because in a swimming pool it's a very warm and humid environment and that can help you to try and maybe be better at a sport. So therefore you could choose that sport over another. And the final one is socioeconomic. So socioeconomic is about cost or status. So certain sports have a particular status. So golf, for instance, is maybe seen as quite an upper class sport because of all the cost that's involved in it. The cost is a really key thing as well because you might be priced out of doing an activity. So for instance, you might enjoy golf and like watching it on sport but not be able to afford to play it. So that might influence whether you take part in that activity